The cold was a constant thief. It stole the feeling from her fingers, the warmth from her breath, the strength from her bones. Alara huddled closer to the sputtering flames of the outdoor kitchen, the meager heat a fleeting comfort against the biting wind of the Blackwood Pack territory. Here, on the lowest rungs of the pack, she was less than a shadow. She was an omega, a servant. But worse than that, she was marked. A jagged, puckered scar ran from the corner of her left eye down to her jaw. The thief's mark, branded into her skin 5 winters ago for a crime she did not commit, for a loaf of bread her starving younger sister had stolen. Her sister had been too small, too frail for the branding iron, so Alara had taken the fall. She'd taken the heat and the pain, and in return, her father had looked away, his shame a heavier blow than any fist. Now, she was a pariah, a walking reminder of disgrace. Tonight was the annual Frost Moon Gathering, a feast to appease the old gods and pray for a mild winter. For the rest of the pack, it was a night of revelry. For Alara, it was a night of endless work and casual cruelty. Omega, more mead for the warriors' table. The voice was sharp, laced with contempt. It belonged to Lyra, another Omega who had learned early that the fastest way to avoid being the lowest was to kick down at whoever was already there. Alara nodded, her gaze fixed on the muddy ground. She didn't speak. Her voice was a currency she couldn't afford to spend. It only ever invited more trouble. She hefted the heavy wooden pitcher, her thin arms trembling under the weight, and navigated the throng of bodies. The air was thick with the smell of roasting boar, pine from the great fires, and the cloying scent of cheap mead. She was invisible until someone wanted her to be seen. A young warrior, his face flushed with drink, intentionally stuck out his foot. Alara stumbled, the mead sloshing over the rim. A few drops splashed onto his boots. "Watch it, Scarface," he snarled, shoving her shoulder. "This filth is probably as cursed as you are." Laughter rippled through the nearby pack members. Her cheeks burned, a phantom heat that had nothing to do with the fires. She kept her head down, murmuring an apology that was swallowed by the noise. As she retreated, a small hand tugged on her tunic. It was a little boy, no older than 5, his eyes wide. He held up a piece of honey cake, slightly squashed. "For you," he whispered, as if sharing a grand secret. A fragile warmth bloomed in Alara's chest, so rare and precious it almost hurt. Before she could accept, the boy's mother snatched him back. "Finn, no, don't touch her. You'll catch her bad luck." The woman shot Alara a venomous glare before dragging her son away. The warmth died, extinguished like a candle in a gale. That was her life. A constant cycle of cold, a brief flicker of warmth, and then a deeper, more profound chill. Later, while serving stew, it happened. A commotion near the high table drew everyone's attention. Lyra, eager to be noticed, shoved past Alara with a tray of roasted birds. The shove was deliberate, hard. Alara lost her footing on the icy ground, the heavy cauldron of stew tipping from her grasp. Hot, greasy liquid splashed across the snow-dusted earth, steaming in the frigid air. A collective gasp went through the crowd. All eyes turned to her. Lyra was the first to speak, her voice ringing with false outrage. "Look what she's done! The clumsy wretch has wasted good food." To punctuate her point, she scooped a handful of wet, cold mud from the ground and flung it. The mud struck Alara's cheek, the cold a shocking slap against her skin. It clung to her scar, thick and vile. Some of it dripped down her neck. The crowd, emboldened, began to jeer. "Ho! Useless Omega! Send her to the kennels! The mark proves her nature, once a thief, always a disgrace." Alara squeezed her eyes shut, her body frozen in a cage of humiliation. She didn't move, didn't wipe the mud away. To react was to show them they had won, that they had broken through the wall of ice she kept around her heart. So she stood there trembling and took it. Then, a change. A silence fell over the clearing, so sudden and absolute it was like the world had lost its breath. The jeers died in throats. The crackling of the great fire seemed to be the only sound left in the universe. A cold, deeper than the winter night, began to radiate through the crowd. It wasn't the natural chill of the air. This was something ancient and predatory, a cold that had teeth. Alara felt it prickle her skin, a wave of profound dread that made the hairs on her arms stand up. She dared to open her eyes. Through the parting crowd, he walked. The Alpha King, Kalen. He was a figure of myth, a ruler from a distant keep who rarely visited the outlying packs. They called him the Winter King, and now she knew why. The air around him shimmered with a visible frost. His hair was the color of spun silver, and his eyes were a piercing glacial blue. He was beautiful in the way a frozen waterfall was beautiful, majestic, silent, and deadly. He moved with a grace that belied his massive frame, his presence sucking all the warmth and noise from the world. The pack alpha, a burly man named Fendril, bowed so low his forehead nearly touched the snow. "Your Majesty, we were not expecting you." Kalen's gaze didn't even flicker toward him. His ice-blue eyes swept over the scene, the spilled stew, the jeering crowd, and Lyra, who now looked terrified. Then, his eyes landed on Alara, and they stopped. For a heartbeat, the world held still. He wasn't looking at her with disgust or pity. He was looking at her with an unnerving intensity, a focus so sharp it felt like a physical touch. His gaze traced the line of her scar, where the mud clung thickest. He started walking again. Not toward the high table, not toward the pack alpha, but directly toward her. The crowd scrambled to get out of his way, their fear a palpable thing. Alara's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drum against the sudden silence. What had she done? Why was he looking at her? He would punish her. He would exile her. He would kill her for disrupting the gathering. He stopped a pace in front of her. He was so tall he blocked out the light from the fire, casting her in his long, cold shadow. Up close, the chill emanating from him was a physical force, seeping into her thin tunic, into her very marrow. She shivered, a violent, uncontrollable tremor. She expected a harsh word, a blow, an order for her execution. Instead, the Alpha King knelt. He knelt in the mud and the spilled stew, his fine black furs brushing against the filth. The entire pack held its breath. A king did not kneel. Not for anyone. Certainly not for a scarred Omega. He lifted a hand, his fingers long and pale. She flinched, expecting pain, but his touch was impossibly gentle as he cupped her jaw. His skin was like ice, a deep, shocking cold that made her gasp. Yet, beneath the cold, there was no malice, only a steady, firm pressure. With his thumb, he slowly, deliberately wiped the mud from her cheek. He cleaned the filth from her scar, his movements careful, reverent. His glacial eyes never left hers, and in their depths, she saw something she couldn't understand. Not pity, not anger. Something that looked like recognition. "Enough," he said. His voice was not a shout but a low rumble, deep as a winter storm but quiet. It carried across the silent clearing, a command that was absolute. He stood, his gaze sweeping over the stunned faces of the pack. His eyes, now chips of ice, landed on Lyra, who whimpered and fell to her knees. Who did this? No one spoke, but a dozen heads subtly turned toward Lyra. Kalen's attention returned to Alara. She was swaying on her feet, overwhelmed by the cold radiating from him, by the shock of his touch, by the sudden, terrifying focus of the most powerful man in the lands. The world was tilting, the edges of her vision going dark. Before she could fall, he moved again. He slid one arm beneath her knees and the other around her back, lifting her as if she weighed nothing. Alara's head fell against his chest. The cold was immense, terrifying. It felt like being pressed against a block of ancient ice. It stole her breath, shocked her system. It should have been agonizing, but beneath the brutal chill, she felt something else. A strange sense of safety, of being held. He turned, ignoring the gasps of the crowd and the sputtering pack alpha. As he walked away from the firelight, carrying her into the darkness, Alara's last conscious thought was of the impossible paradox of being held by winter itself, and for the first time in her life, not feeling completely alone in the cold. She woke to the sensation of being cold, but a different kind of cold. It was a dry, clean chill, the air crisp and still, unlike the damp, biting misery she was used to. She was lying on something impossibly soft, a bed piled high with furs that smelled faintly of pine and winter frost. Panic seized her. She sat up, her heart pounding. The room was vast, carved from dark wood and stone. A huge, unlit hearth dominated one wall. Moonlight streamed through a tall, arched window, illuminating swirling patterns of frost on the inside of the glass. This was no Omega's hovel. This was a king's chamber. "You are awake." The voice came from the shadows near the window. King Kalen stepped into the moonlight. He had shed his heavy outer cloak, and in a simple black tunic he looked less like a king and more like a predator at rest. The unnatural cold in the room emanated from him, a silent, oppressive aura. Ilara scrambled back on the bed, pulling the furs up to her chin. "Your Majesty," she whispered, her voice hoarse. I am sorry for the disruption." "It was not your fault," he stated simply. It was not a reassurance. It was a fact. He moved closer and she instinctively flinched. He stopped, maintaining a careful distance. "Do you know why you are here?" She shook her head, her eyes wide with fear and confusion. "For centuries," he began, his voice low and even, a strange contrast to the turmoil she felt. "My bloodline has carried a curse, a frost that grows within. It feeds on my power, on my life force. With every passing year, the ice spreads. It is consuming me." He held up his left hand. In the pale moonlight, she could see it. A delicate, terrifying tracery of blue veins beneath his skin, like frost patterns on a windowpane. The sight sent a shiver of horror through her. "The healers can do nothing," he continued, his gaze distant. "The mages are powerless. But the old legend spoke of a counterbalance, a spark, a fire born in the blood of the ancient sun-callers, a line thought to be extinguished 1,000 years ago. A warmth that could hold the ice at bay." He looked at her then, his glacial eyes locking onto hers. "I have been searching for that spark my entire life. I have walked through 100 packs, 1,000 villages, and I have found nothing. Until tonight." Alara stared at him, bewildered. "Me? Your Majesty, I am nothing. An Omega. A marked one." The words felt like ash in her mouth. "Your mark is irrelevant," he said, dismissing her entire identity with a single sentence. "When I saw you standing by the fire, I felt it. A flicker. A tiny ember of warmth in a world of ice. When I touched you, the cold in my veins quieted for the first time in a century." She remembered his touch, the shocking cold of his skin against hers. She hadn't felt any warmth. She had only felt the ice. "I do not understand," she whispered. "You do not have to," he replied. "You have a choice. Return to your pack, to the mud and the scorn, or stay here with me, in this frozen keep, at my side." Hope, a dangerous and unfamiliar emotion, fluttered in her chest. "Stay here?" He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. "This is not an offer of mateship," he said, his voice becoming hard, clinical. The brief flicker of connection was gone, replaced by the cold ruler. "There can be no bond between us. The curse feeds on emotion. Any affection would only hasten its progress. It would be a death sentence. For me. The words were like a douse of icy water. Of course, this wasn't a rescue. It was a transaction. The arrangement would be simple, he continued, his tone devoid of any feeling. You will be my companion. Your presence, your proximity, is what I require. You will be a living hearth in my frozen world. In return, you will have my protection. You will have food, shelter, clothing. No one will ever harm you again. It is a practical solution for us both. He finished, his face an unreadable mask of stone. I cannot offer you warmth. I cannot offer you affection. I can only offer you my protection. It will have to be enough. Alara looked at her hands, rough and chapped from years of servitude. She thought of the mud on her face, the laughter of the crowd, the shame in her father's eyes. She thought of a life of hunger and cold and being less than human. Then she looked at the Winter King, a man trapped in his own eternal winter, offering her a place beside him in the ice. It was a cage, perhaps, but it was a cage where she would be safe. I accept, she said, her voice barely a whisper, but clear in the silent, cold room. The days that followed were a strange new kind of prison. The king's keep was a fortress of basalt and ice, perched on the highest peak of the mountains. The corridors were silent, the servants' ghosts who bowed and scraped and never met her eyes. And everywhere, there was the cold. It clung to the stone walls, seeped from the floors, and radiated from the man who was her constant shadow. Kaelin was true to his word. It was an arrangement. She had her own chambers, adjacent to his, filled with fine clothes she was afraid to touch and books she couldn't read. She ate at his table, the food rich and plentiful, though the king himself barely touched it. He was always near, a silent, brooding presence. He never touched her. After that first night, he kept a careful distance of at least 5 feet at all times. But he watched her. His icy eyes followed her every move. When she shivered, he would have a servant add another log to the fire. When she looked pale, he would order the cook to make a hearty broth. They were gestures of a keeper tending to a valuable asset, not of a man caring for a woman. Yet, intimacy crept in through the cracks of their cold arrangement. One evening, she found him staring into the flames of the great hall's hearth, his left hand clenched into a fist at his side. She could see the blue veins pulsing faintly, a sign of his pain. Without thinking, she went to the kitchens and brewed a pot of steaming elderberry tea, a remedy her mother used to make for winter chills. She brought it to him, her hands wrapped around the warm ceramic mug. She held it out. For you, Your Majesty. He looked from the mug to her face, a flicker of surprise in his eyes. He didn't take it. I cannot tolerate much heat, he said, his voice tight. Just hold it, she said softly. You don't have to drink it. He hesitated, then slowly reached out and took the mug. His cold fingers brushed hers and a jolt went through her. He held the mug, his gaze fixed on the steam rising from its surface. He didn't say thank you, but he didn't put it down. He just sat there, holding the small piece of warmth she had given him. She began to see past his mask of ice. She saw the exhaustion in the lines around his eyes, the constant, subtle tension in his shoulders. She saw the loneliness of a man who had lived for centuries without a single warm touch. He was not just a king. He was a prisoner. He, in turn, began to see past her damage. He saw her kindness to the servants, the way she would save a piece of her bread for the kennel hounds. He saw the quiet resilience that had allowed her to survive a lifetime of cruelty without becoming cruel herself. One afternoon, a portly, sneering man with a neatly trimmed gray beard approached her in the library. He introduced himself as Lord Valerius, the king's chief advisor. An interesting pet the king has found for himself, Valerius said, his eyes roaming over her scar with disdain. "Tell me, little Omega, what parlor tricks do you perform to keep his attention?" Ilara stiffened. "I am not a pet." Valerius chuckled, a dry, unpleasant sound. "Of course not. You are a cure, a walking poultice. But I wonder if you are a cure or another symptom of the disease." His smile was thin and sharp. "Be careful you do not overstep. The king's fascinations are fleeting. His displeasure, however, is eternal." Before she could respond, Kalen's voice cut through the air, cold as a razor. "Valerius." The advisor spun around, his sneer vanishing, replaced by a mask of fawning respect. "Your Majesty, I was just welcoming our guest." Kalen moved to stand beside Alara, his proximity a clear declaration. The temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. "I was addressing my future queen," he said, his voice dangerously soft, "and you will address her as such." The words hung in the air, stunning both Alara and Valerius into silence. Future queen? He had explicitly said this was not about mateship. What had changed? Valerius bowed low, his face pale. "Of course, my king. 1,000 apologies, your highness." He backed away, his eyes filled with a venomous hatred that was now directed entirely at her. When he was gone, Alara turned to Kalen, her heart racing. "Why did you say that?" "He needed to be reminded of his place," Kalen said, avoiding her eyes. "And yours." "But you said—" "I know what I said." He cut her off, a hint of frustration in his tone. "Things are more complicated than I anticipated." He was breaking his own rules. The boundary he had set was eroding, and the tension between what they had agreed to and what was actually growing between them was becoming a tangible thing, a silent hum in the cold air of the keep. That night, she dreamt of fire. Not a destructive, raging inferno, but a warm, golden light that lived inside her chest. In the dream, she reached out and touched Kalen's icy skin, and instead of flinching from his cold, she melted it away. She woke with a gasp, her own skin strangely warm in the chilled room. She was beginning to realize that the king was not the only one in this castle, with a secret locked away inside him. Lord Valerius did not take the king's public rebuke well. He was a man who had thrived in the cold, a creature of shadows and whispers. Alara's presence, this inexplicable warmth at the king's side, was a threat to the frozen order he had so carefully cultivated for decades. He saw her not as a person, but as a disruption, an impurity in the sterile, controlled world he managed. The whispers started subtly. A servant mentioning that the castle's enchanted frost wards seemed weaker since the Omega's arrival. A guard complaining of a strange, feverish feeling when he stood watch near her chambers. Valerius fanned these embers of doubt with practiced ease. He began his true campaign in the council chambers. "The king's affliction worsens," he announced one morning, his face a mask of grave concern. "The frost in his veins is more active than I have seen it in 20 years. It began, you will note, shortly after the arrival of this girl. She is a comfort to him." Another council member, an old general named Borin, argued. "He seems more at ease." "A false comfort," Valerius countered, his voice rising, "a siren's song luring him to his doom. She is not a cure, she is a poison. Her so-called warmth is a parasitic magic, a dark art that agitates the curse, making it fight back with greater ferocity. She is draining his life to feed her own power." He used her scar as his proof. "Look at her. Marked as a criminal, a creature of deceit. Do we truly believe that salvation for our king would come in such a tainted vessel? She is a witch, and her spell is killing him." The rumors slithered out from the keep and down into the town, carried by merchants and servants. The pack members who had once scorned her now feared her. They saw her as a sorceress who had ensnared their cold, distant king, a blight on the land. Alara felt the shift. The servants who had begun to offer her tentative smiles now averted their eyes, making signs to ward off evil as she passed. The air grew heavy with suspicion. One day, Valerius cornered her in a secluded courtyard, the bare branches of the trees like skeletal fingers against the gray sky. "Enjoying your time in the sun, little witch?" he hissed, his proximity unnerving. "I am not a witch," Alara said, her voice shaking but firm. She would not cower before him. "No? Then what are you?" he sneered. You arrive, and the king, who has not shown a flicker of emotion in a century, declares you his future queen and begins to decay at an accelerated rate. These are not coincidences. He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. Let me tell you a secret about the king's curse, something he was too foolish or too bewitched to tell you himself. The frost is tied to his heart. It lies dormant when he is cold, when he is empty. But when he feels joy, anger, hope, love, the curse awakens. It feeds on that emotional energy. It grows stronger. Alara's blood ran cold. Don't you see? Valerius's eyes glinted with triumph. His growing affection for you, his ridiculous sentimental attachment, it is literally killing him. Every kind word, every protective glance is another nail in his coffin. You are not his hearth, you are his funeral pyre. The words struck her with the force of a physical blow. She stumbled back, her hand flying to her mouth. It couldn't be true. But it made a terrible, horrifying kind of sense. The way he'd grown more tired lately. The way the blue veins in his hands seemed more pronounced. If you care for him at all, you will leave, Valerius said, his voice smooth as poisoned silk. Vanish. Disappear into the wilderness. It is the only way to save him. Stay, and you will be his executioner. He walked away, leaving her alone in the courtyard, the truth of his words a shard of ice in her heart. He was right. She had to leave. But the thought of returning to the cold, of leaving Kalen to his lonely fate, was an agony she could barely comprehend. That night, a blizzard descended upon the mountains, a storm of unnatural ferocity. The winds howled like starving wolves, and the temperature plummeted. The very stones of the keep seemed to groan under the assault of the cold. Ilara was in her chambers, packing a small bag with a loaf of bread and a skin of water, her heart breaking with every move. She would leave before dawn. It was the only way. A sudden crash from the adjoining throne room made her jump. It was followed by a heavy, sickening thud. Fear, sharp and absolute, sliced through her resolve. "Kalen?" she whispered. She ran from her room, her bare feet silent on the cold stone. She pushed open the heavy doors to the throne room. The sight that met her eyes would be seared into her memory forever. Kalen lay collapsed at the foot of his throne. The great hearth was roaring, but it provided no warmth. A visible aura of frost radiated from his body, creeping across the floor in delicate, deadly patterns. His skin was pale as marble, and the blue veins on his hands and neck were now a deep, terrifying sapphire, pulsing with a faint, cold light. Crystalline frost was forming in his silver hair and on his eyelashes. He was turning to ice. "Guards! Healers!" a voice bellowed. Valerius burst into the room, followed by several council members and armed guards. He took one look at the scene and his eyes flew to Ilara. "Seize her!" he roared, pointing a trembling finger at her. "See what the Omega Witch has done. She has brought this storm upon us. She has finally broken him." The guards advanced, their spears leveled. Ilara didn't even notice them. Her entire world had narrowed to the frozen figure on the floor. She could see the faint, shallow puff of his breath, each one weaker than the last. He was dying. Valerius's words echoed in her mind. "His affection for you is killing him. This was her fault." Her presence, the small warmth he had allowed himself to feel for her, had triggered this. Despair, thick and suffocating, threatened to drown her. It was over. It was too late. He had offered her safety, and she had brought him death. The guards were almost upon her, but as their hands reached out to grab her, something inside her snapped. The despair didn't break her. It ignited. No, she would not run. She would not let them take her, and she would not let him die. With a cry that was torn from the depths of her soul, she broke free from their grasp and ran to Kaylin's side. She fell to her knees on the frost-covered floor, ignoring the biting cold that seeped through her thin nightdress. "Kaylin," she sobbed, her tears freezing on her cheeks. She reached out, her trembling hands hovering over his chest. She remembered his warning. "I cannot tolerate much heat." She remembered Valerius's poison. "You will be his executioner." But looking at him now, so still and cold, she knew that the only thing that could kill him was the absence of warmth. The arrangement was a lie. The distance was a lie. He didn't need to be protected from her spark. He needed to be consumed by it. "Stop her!" Valerius shrieked. "She's trying to finish him." The guards lunged, but before they could reach her, Alara placed her hands flat against the icy armor of Kaylin's tunic, directly over his heart. She closed her eyes and poured everything she was into that touch. All her pain, her loneliness, her grief. All the stolen moments of quiet understanding, the unspoken kindnesses, the burgeoning, impossible love she felt for this frozen king. She thought of the little boy with the honey cake, of Kaylin's gentle thumb wiping mud from her face, of his voice calling her his queen. She refused to let go. "No," she whispered, a vow against the howling wind and the panicked shouts. "I won't let you." A pulse of warmth, faint as a heartbeat, radiated from her palms. Then another, stronger this time. A gasp went through the room. The frost on Kaylin's chest began to melt where her hands rested. Alara focused harder, channeling a strength she never knew she possessed. It felt like opening a floodgate inside her soul. A golden light began to glow beneath her palms, soft at first, then growing in intensity. The scar on her face, the thief's mark, began to burn. Not with pain, but with a clean, searing heat. It blazed to life, the ugly, puckered flesh transforming into a shimmering line of pure, golden light. The guards recoiled, shielding their eyes as waves of palpable heat rolled off her. The oppressive cold in the throne room was pushed back, retreating from her like a tide. The frost on the floors sizzled and vanished. The icy patterns on the walls melted, running down in streams of water. This was not a spark. It was an inferno. The power surged through her, a wild, beautiful, terrifying thing. It was the fire from her dreams, the warmth of 1,000 suns, and it was hers. She was not a poultice. She was a furnace, and she would burn this curse to ash. The golden light from her hands sank into Kaylin's chest, a river of fire pouring into a frozen sea. The sapphire veins beneath his skin flared violently, then began to recede. The crystalline frost in his hair evaporated. Color began to return to his lips, his face. With a final, explosive pulse of light that filled the entire throne room, the aura of cold around him shattered like glass. The room fell silent, save for the crackling of the now ordinary fire in the hearth. The blizzard outside had ceased. The wind was still. Alara slumped forward, the power receding, leaving her utterly drained but strangely whole. A hand, strong and warm, caught her before she could fall. Kaylin's eyes were open. They were no longer the color of ice. They were a clear, deep gray like a calm sky after a storm. He gasped, a deep, shuddering breath that was not a struggle for air, but a true, full lungful of it. He sat up, pushing himself off the floor with an ease he hadn't possessed in decades. He looked at his hands. The blue veins were gone. The unnatural pallor was gone. He flexed his fingers. a look of profound wonder on his face. Then he looked at Alara. His gaze fell on her face, on the scar that was no longer a mark of shame, but a beautiful, shimmering brand of liquid gold. Ilara, he breathed. Her name on his lips was different now. It was not the rasp of winter, but the warm, deep sound of life. He reached out, his fingers tracing the glowing mark on her cheek. His touch was warm. For the first time, truly wonderfully warm. The stunned silence in the room was broken by Valerius. "It's a trick," he stammered, his face ashen with terror and disbelief. "A witch's illusion." Kalen's head snapped toward him. He rose to his feet in a single fluid motion, pulling Alara up with him. He stood tall, not as a dying king encased in ice, but as a true alpha, radiating power and vitality. "She is no witch." Kalen's voice rang through the hall, filled with an authority that left no room for argument. "She is my mate, and she is my queen." He turned back to Alara, his hands cupping her face. "I felt you," he whispered, for her alone. "Even in the ice, I felt your fire. I felt your love." Tears streamed down her face, but they were not tears of sorrow. "I thought Valerius said my love was killing you." "He lied," Kalen said, his voice thick with emotion. "The curse fed on my cold, on my loneliness. It thrived in the absence of warmth. I was a fool to believe that isolating my heart would save me. I was wrong. Your love didn't kill me, Alara. It was the only thing that could ever save me." He leaned down and kissed her. It was not a cold, chaste kiss of an arrangement. It was a kiss of fire and life, of centuries of loneliness melting away in a single moment. It was a promise of 1,000 sunrises, a vow made in the heart of a dead winter, now reborn as spring. In the warmth of his arms, with her inner fire finally free, Ilara felt her own self-doubt. The brand of worthlessness she had carried for so long finally burn away into nothing. 6 months passed. Spring came to the northern lands with a vibrancy not seen in living memory. The snows melted early, revealing rich, dark earth. Wildflowers bloomed in fields that had long been barren. The people called it the Queen's Thaw. Alara, their fire queen, stood on the balcony of the great keep, a gentle breeze stirring her hair. The golden mark on her face no longer felt strange. It felt like a part of her, a visible sign of the fire she carried within. It shimmered in the morning sun, a beacon of hope rather than a brand of shame. Lord Valerius was in the deepest cell of the dungeons, stripped of his titles and his power. His whispers had been replaced by a stone-cold silence. Some of the pack members who had jeered at her that night had come to her, their heads bowed, offering apologies she accepted with a grace that shamed them more than any punishment could have. She had learned that true strength wasn't in retribution, but in rebuilding. A pair of warm, strong arms wrapped around her from behind. Kalen rested his chin on her shoulder, his presence a comforting weight against her back. The unnatural cold was a distant memory, replaced by a steady, living warmth that was entirely his own. "What are you thinking about?" he murmured, his breath warm against her ear. "I was thinking about the mud," she confessed softly. "How cold it was." He turned her in his arms, his gray eyes soft. He gently touched her scar, his fingers tracing the golden line. "I remember the fire in your eyes that night," he said. "Even covered in filth, surrounded by fools, you were burning. I was the one who was truly cold, frozen, and you thawed me." The world had changed, not just for them, but for everyone. With the curse broken, Kalen ruled with a new vitality. His decisions were no longer tempered by the constant gnawing pain of the frost. He was a king reborn, and she was the queen who had saved him. But here, in these quiet moments, they were not monarchs. They were simply Kalen and Alara. Two broken souls who had found their missing half in the most unlikely of places. He had saved her from a life of scorn and misery. He had given her a home, a name, a purpose. She had saved him from a death of ice and solitude. She had given him back his life, his warmth, his heart. It was a mutual rescue, a perfect balance. "My father sent a letter," she said, leaning her head against his chest, listening to the steady, strong beat of his heart. "He asked for forgiveness. He said he was proud of me." "And what did you do?" Kaylin asked. "I burned it," she said simply. Not out of anger, but out of acceptance. That part of her life was over. Her family was here now. Her pack was the man holding her. He held her tighter, understanding everything she didn't say. They stood in comfortable silence for a long time, watching the sun climb higher over their green, thawing kingdom. The future was no longer a terrifying, frozen expanse. It was a path they would walk together, side by side. "Does it hurt?" he asked quietly, his thumb stroking her cheek just below the golden mark. She looked up at him, into the eyes that had once been chips of ice and were now warm as a summer sky. She thought of the branding iron, the jeers, the loneliness, the crushing weight of being worthless, and she thought of the fire that had burned it all away. "Not anymore," she whispered. And for the first time in her life, it was the absolute truth.